Good morning, everyone. I'm Leandra Letterman. I'm the William W. Oliver Chair Emerita in Tax Law at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Alex Zhang is an assistant professor of law at Emory University. His teaching and research interests include federal income taxation, tax policy, partnership taxation, administrative law, and tax-exempt organizations. He is particularly interested in how tax law and administration interact with and might vindicate foundational norms like equality, transparency, and anti-discrimination. His research has been published by or is forthcoming from Virginia Law Review, Cornell Law Review, George Washington Law Review, NYU Law Review Online, Stanford Law Review Online, and Tax Notes, among others. Before joining the Emory faculty, Zhang clerked for the Honorable William A. Fletcher on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and for the Honorable Guido Calabresi on the Second Circuit. He received a JD from Yale Law School, where he served as managing editor of the Yale Law Journal and won the Clifford L. Porter Prize in Taxation, as well as the Christopher E. Bergen Award from Tax Notes. He also received a PhD in classics and philosophy from Yale University. And today he is presenting fiscal citizenship and taxpayer privacy. And with that, Alex, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Leandra, for the invitation and for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk. I'm really looking forward to your insights. I will try to not talk too much so as to leave as much time for Q&A as possible. And my draft isn't due to the Law Journal for a few months, so I still have lots of time to incorporate your feedback, which I'm looking forward to. This project is about taxpayer privacy, that is whether and to what extent an individual's tax return information like income and tax liabilities should be public records or kept confidential. The paper builds a model of fiscal citizenship based on the taxpayers' interactions with the fiscal apparatus of democratic regimes. And I argue that tax disclosure and confidentiality really depend on this dynamic relationship. So today I want to do three things. First, I want to start with some historical and comparative background. The U.S. income tax mandated publicity of tax returns at three critical junctures. And today, Nordic countries allow a significant degree of disclosure of taxpayer information. Both compliance and constitutional, small c constitutional and egalitarian justifications really animated the development of these disclosure regimes. And second, I want to show that in interacting with the fiscal state, taxpayers primarily play four different roles: as reporters of non-public information, as funders of the state, as stakeholders in a fiscal community, and as legislative and policy-making partners with the government in shaping tax policy on the ground. The values of transparency and privacy have distinct valences among these respective roles, and taxpayers partake in these roles to different degrees given their own income and income inequality in the fiscal community. And third, I want to suggest that under this taxonomy, disclosure is more appropriate for the tax record of the ultra-wealthy in times of high economic inequality. So first, background. Most income tax systems today provide for the confidentiality of taxpayer information. The Tax Reform Act of 1976, for example, bans disclosure of any tax record with limited exceptions like a request from the House Ways and Means Committee. And that, of course, was central to the recent dispute over former President Trump's tax returns. But secrecy has not always been the rule. In the United States, transparency prevailed first in the 1860s during our first income tax that funded the Civil War. Despite complaints of inquisitorial tax collectors to satisfy the morbid curiosity of the masses, Congress codified the public's right to inspect income tax returns in the Revenue Act of 1864. and newspapers routinely published the incomes of the wealthy and the powerful. And at that time, proponents justified publicity in egalitarian terms that took two forms. They spoke of equalizing tax burdens, that is, disclosure of tax returns was an automatic enforcement tool that would result in revenue gains. But they also justified tax transparency on constitutional grounds. Government records in a democracy should be open to public scrutiny, and the tax records of the rich were not exempt. And of course, there were also practical reasons for tax publicity during this period, because there was no administrative apparatus to really enforce and collect the taxes. So you needed a way to provide people with notice. After the Civil War, the United States paused taxing income, but the transparency regime came back with the Revenue Act of 1924, which is about a decade after the reinstitution of the income tax itself. So progressive lawmakers explicitly justified tax disclosure on the ground of citizenship in the 1920s. That is, an individual's covenant with the state and the nature of the political community. They made four primary arguments. First, they drew a baseline for transparency. Tax returns were public records, in particular for ultra-wealthy taxpayers. The few decades before the 1920s saw immense capital accumulation and expansion of corporate power. So for lawmakers in the 1920s, the distinction between public utilities and private entities is really one of degree and not of nature. And ultra-wealthy taxpayers' economic power made them more akin to public utilities and demanded disclosure. And transparency also cohered with the constitutional requirement for Congress to publish its receipts and expenditures in Article 1. And second, progressive lawmakers emphasized the instrumental democratic value of transparency. It helps citizens deliberate on fiscal governance, and legislators craft tax laws on an informed basis. And third, they saw transparency's potential to curb government abuse of selective release of information. So in the 1920s, Congress had a really hard time getting the executive branch to release tax data for its fairly legitimate investigations. Under the regime before the Revenue Act of 1924, tax returns were, in fact, statutorily public records, but public inspection of those records was available only on the basis of Treasury regulations approved by the president. And when Congress asked the Treasury Department to hand over tax returns in connection with what would turn out to be the Teapot Dome scandal, the president relied on a Department of Justice memo to deny that request. It made a very interesting but probably specious distinction between inspection and transmission, and said the executive branch had no power to hand over the tax returns, as opposed to letting individual members of Congress go into the Treasury Department to look at them. And Congress at this point also suspected the Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, of releasing the tax returns of his political opponents. So there really was a real worry that the information asymmetry between the two branches would impede one from the performance of its constitutional duties. And fourth and lastly, lawmakers relied on the revenue potential of publicity, both to combat noncompliance and to close loopholes that enable tax avoidance in the income tax regime. Congress abolished the tax disclosure regime of 1924 after sustained protests by Secretary Mellon, whose very large income tax liability was advertised by the newspapers, but it mandated transparency again in 1934, this time at the height of economic inequality during the Great Depression. But the regime was abrogated before it went into effect after a very curious populist campaign. So these historical tax disclosure regimes have contemporary counterparts. Today, Nordic countries allow a substantial degree of disclosure of taxpayer information, and the demand for transparency is really deeply embedded in the constitution of the state. Finland, for example, discloses the taxpayers' labor and capital income under its tax disclosure regime for the stated purpose of promoting openness and public discussion in tax policy. And in Sweden, transparency of government records has been enshrined in the constitution as the Freedom of the Press Act since 1766. The constitutional baseline is therefore right of the public to access official documents broadly defined to include all documents held or drawn up by the state. And tax confidentiality is justified only to the extent that it protects the personal circumstances of the taxpayer. So while tax decisions like calculations of different types of income are public, the sources of the deductions are confidential, unless the taxpayer is audited and then the information becomes a public tax decision. So importantly, these disclosure regimes are not justified on revenue-based grounds. Instead, it flows through a default of open governance and channels democratic functions. And so all of these historical entrants and contemporary regimes have really justified transparency on the basis of considerations in constituting a democratic and egalitarian fiscal state. But what exactly is this notion of fiscal citizenship that might inform the design of tax disclosure regimes? Now, I just want to disentangle the concept a little bit and argue that taxpayers play 4 different roles in interacting with the fiscal state. First, taxpayers are reporters of non-public information. This is most prominent when individual taxpayers self-assess their tax liability and report their incomes and other financial data to the state. Confidentiality here serves the individual's informational and decisional privacy grounded in their autonomy. That is the protection of personal and sensitive information that individuals might reasonably want the state to keep secret. But of course, that privacy value matters only if the information is non-public in the first place. If the taxpayer's income and net worth are publicly accessible, the fact that the state provides access to it in addition to private outlets will not really promote the normative goals of privacy. So here, privacy values are more important for lower and middle income households than ultra wealthy households because the wealth of and the income of ultra wealthy households are already widely publicized by popular media, and government officials whose incomes and property holdings are subject to disclosure might be another example. And a transparency regime that carefully selects what data or data ranges to disclose to minimize intrusion into individual privacy is also another way to mitigate the harm to privacy here. And second, taxpayers are funders of the state by collectively bearing the costs of governance. The values of privacy and transparency here, I think, sound in an egalitarian distribution of tax burdens. That is the potential of disclosure to improve both compliance and mobilize legislation to improve tax fairness. And the revenue potential of transparency is contested. Scholars have offered distinct theories in favor or against disclosure, and these include taxpayer trust. So taxpayers entrust the government with non-public information on the promise of confidentiality. Also includes social audit theories, that is, disclosure functions as an enforcement tool because taxpayers more accurately report their income when they know others will see their tax returns. And also behavioral and reciprocity-based arguments. For example, taxpayers would calibrate their compliance in accordance with their perception of the overall compliance level in the tax system. And empirical studies have not really reached conclusive results, but I think there are some reasons to think that disclosure of ultra-wealthy taxpayers' data would not incentivize non-compliance. So for example, scholars have recently argued that disclosure would deprive the federal government of the use of taxpayers' cognitive biases, like heavily advertising and making salient instances of success in enforcement and hiding failures in enforcement. And that might very well be true for middle and lower income taxpayers. I think for wealthy taxpayers, they have immense resources at their disposal to mitigate their cognitive biases. And selective release of individual enforcement data might not decrease their compliance levels. But the other side of this democratic response, I think, strongly suggests that disclosure of ultra-wealthy taxpayers' data could build political pressure to shape the law in accordance with the public's perception of fairness. in part because there are more violations of horizontal and vertical equity in the distribution of ultra-wealthy households' tax burdens. So transparency has a robust operation, I think, in ultra-wealthy but not lower and middle-income taxpayers in their capacity as funders. Third, taxpayers are really stakeholders in a fiscal community. Tax policy is a central mechanism for the state to effect redistribution. And in the United States, given the lack of robust welfare and social insurance programs, taxation is really the primary redistributive tool of the federal government. An entitlement, I think, to a fiscal benefit within an egalitarian regime means the ability to claim that benefit with dignity. Congress wrote welfare programs into the tax code precisely because it might reduce stigma. So here, privacy value, I think, is especially important for lower income households that need to claim tax or welfare benefits through filing the tax returns. And fourth, I think taxpayers are policy-making partners with the government in shaping tax policy. That is, taxpayers not only are subject to tax law, but also make tax law by their choices in and interactions with the fiscal state. In our system of voluntary compliance and self-assessment, Congress has delegated to ordinary citizens the authority to determine their tax liabilities. And this delegation comes with substantial discretion in interpreting federal tax statutes and regulations, and it has allowed ultra-wealthy taxpayers in particular to achieve immense variation in tax burdens while having similar levels of income. To be sure, I think this is mostly legal tax avoidance, but the exercise of interpretive discretion and policymaking power in general is predicated on transparency. Congress, for example, has delegated immense power to agencies to interpret and implement federal statutes. And the rise of the administrative state and its policymaking power is really against a background assumption of transparency. The APA, the Administrative Procedure Act, made agency records open to public inspection, and the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, broadened this commitment to open governance. And so agencies can really only exercise policymaking power on the basis of these transparency provisions. And I think so too here with ultra-wealthy taxpayers, who both have a lot of delegated power. And as I've already mentioned, sort of like lower income households will share in the stakeholder role a little bit more, as they're entitled to the welfare benefits that are based on the determination of their income. And ultra-wealthy taxpayers might partake less in the reporter role, because much of the information that they report are already subject to public scrutiny, and a little bit more in the policymaker role. And second, I think the distribution of income and wealth within the political community itself might affect how much any individual partakes in each role. For example, a higher level of economic inequality might mean that lower income households partake more in the stakeholder role, which accentuates the need for privacy. Might also mean that ultra-wealthy households partake more in the policy-making role, which accentuates the need for disclosure. And I just want to conclude by drawing out some implications of this model on the design of tax disclosure regimes. Under this notion of fiscal citizenship, tax transparency is more appropriate for ultra-wealthy taxpayers, in particular in times of high economic inequality. That's when they play even more of a role of policymaker in interacting with the fiscal state, where privacy values are least pronounced. And by contrast, confidentiality might be more appropriate for low-income households when they partake more in the stakeholder role. And this, I think, in a way coheres with the historical story I told earlier in the talk. Tax transparency regimes flourished in the United States when the income tax targeted the rich, when disclosure would only affect ultra-wealthy taxpayers. They also flourished when economic inequality, as well as the demand for redistribution, were high. As the income tax transformed from a class tax to a mass tax after World War II, and inequality diminished with the New Deal, the drive for tax transparency diminished. But as we enter another age of the kind of erosion of economic equality that is foundational to egalitarianism, calls for tax disclosure and scrutiny of the ultra-wealthy's fiscal contribution to the state have really intensified. And I hope that this model of fiscal citizenship can provide some food for thought for the design of those reforms to confidentiality and disclosure regimes. And with that, I welcome any questions, comments, and would love to hear your insight.